It's the week ending Saturday, the 12th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen 18 men found guilty of sex grooming in Newcastle, President Trump threatening fire and fury against North Korea, and Edinburgh beginning its 70th Fringe Festival. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team this week are Wassall, Arion McNicoll and Holden Frith. And starting the show this week, it's Holden. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think it marked the beginning of the end of a mighty political force.
We've all travelled a different journey to get here. And growing up in Soweto in the 1980s, I witnessed, like many of you, the sharp end of apartheid brutality. And I swore I would do all that I could with what I have to fight oppression in this country. I never imagined that one day I would be here in this parliament fighting a new form of oppression, a corrupt system that keeps our people imprisoned in poverty. If you told me that one day our democratically elected president would end up corrupted and captured by a criminal syndicate, I would have never believed you.
Mmusi Maimane, the leader of the Democratic Alliance in South Africa, speaking earlier this week. So, Holden, this is about Jacob Zuma.
Yes.
President of South Africa.
Yep.
And his no-confidence vote this week.
Yes. The vote itself failed, but the reason I think it matters is that it failed quite narrowly. It came within 21 votes, and that means several of his own MPs voted to remove him from office. This is all part of a much broader and deeper political shift. The ANC, once Nelson Mandela's party, has now been in office for 23 years, and it still presents itself as the only party with the moral authority to govern post-apartheid South Africa. But it's now facing a pincer movement, both from a breakaway movement on the left and a much more strong and credible centrist opposition party led by the man we've just heard, Mmusi Maimane, who is leader of the Democratic Alliance.
And that used to be, basically, to be crude, that used to be a whites party, right, in apartheid era?
That's right. It was an anti-apartheid party, but because politics was exclusively the preserve of whites, it was a white party, and it was actually led until a couple of years ago by a white woman called Helen Zille.
So you might think that's a hard sell for black South Africans.
And it's a particularly hard sell when the job of the opposition in the current political setup is really to lecture the government about corruption and incompetence. And for obvious historical reasons, this just doesn't sit well with the large majority of the population when it's coming from a white woman. The new leader, Maimane, is black. He is married to a white woman. That, to some people, is seen as a huge advantage because it seems sort of symbolically optimistic. For diehard ANC supporters, this raises a great deal of suspicions about him, and he has been presented as a lackey of white South Africans. He's been accused of wanting to bring apartheid back. This seems slightly unfair given the party's history as an anti-apartheid party. But you heard in that clip, he's clearly trying to position himself as a product of the anti-apartheid struggle and to put Zuma on the wrong side of that history.
Okay, so it is perhaps a turning point in the sense that, this was only, as you suggest, very narrowly won by Jacob Zuma, this vote of no confidence. But nonetheless, it was won by Jacob Zuma. He is still the president of South Africa. So Ashley, is this a turning point really, or is this just more evidence that you can be accused of corruption in many African countries and continue to be president and actually nothing's changed? This isn't a significant moment.
I think that's the real question, isn't it? I mean, there's been this change over time and this apparent waning of support, but the ANC still got 60% of the popular vote at the last election. Black South Africans still make up around 80% of the population. It is very, very unlikely. It is perceived on many commentators perceive that the ANC will be voted out in favour of the Democratic Alliance when the suspicions that Holden was alluding to still persist. I think it's also characteristic, I think, of some of these countries, and we have a similar thing in Northern Ireland, actually, in a very different context, where countries that have had such acrimonious histories have such sectarian politics now, where your own history, your own personal history defines who you vote for. And I'm not sure that even despite... I mean, these allegations aren't new against Jacob Zuma. This has been the case since 2009. Is it 783 allegations against him? And they've just been mounting and mounting over time. I'm not making any comment on whether they're true or not, but, if there's a smoke without fire argument, there's 783 fires there. So, it seems to me that, in fact, the real issue here is that he still does limp along, that the ANC still does limp along.
And I think that's maybe the point as well, that coming back to what Holden said about the ANC continuing to claim that it's the only party that has any moral authority. Surely, with all of these accusations against Zuma, the problem is that moral authority has been leaking away, not just from him, but from the party via him. So he's almost becoming an impediment to the party that he leads.
I think that is the case. And there were quite a few South African political analysts who are saying that the Democratic Alliance will actually be quite grateful that they lost this vote, because keeping him in office does them a great deal of good. But on the more broad point about whether he is in effect immune to all of these claims because of the history, I think there does seem to be a shift there. And at the last election, which was municipal elections across South Africa, the Democratic Alliance had more black votes than white votes for the first time. It took control of Johannesburg, or at least it displaced the ANC from control of Johannesburg and formed a minority government there. It also rules Cape Town and the Western Cape. So across the country, there are all of these areas where people are shifting away from the established party. And so far, the DA's record in government has been pretty good. There's a general perception that they have cleaned out a lot of corruption within these local authorities, and that seems to be building up more willingness to vote more broadly for them.
But at the end of the year, as I understand it, Zuma's stepping down as leader of the ANC anyway, although he'll remain president if he manages to cling on for another 2 years. So,
that's right.
I mean, from this point of view, in August, that feels like a long way away. It's many weeks away. But on the other hand, it is conceivable, isn't it? You can cling on, they'll get a new leader, and they'll be able to say, we're a different party now.
That's true, and part of what's going on now is a power struggle about who replaces him. His favoured candidate is his former wife. So there is a worry amongst his opponents, both in the ANC and beyond, that actually, although the leader of the party will change, the agenda and the atmosphere of politics won't.
Arion.
I think also, you say that it's going to be a relatively short period of time until we get this political transition. But actually, when you consider that we've only had Trump for 6 months and it feels like 6 years, I'm sure if you're over there, it must feel like an enormously long time to have to put up with a person who is increasingly being implicated in more and more potential corruption matters. Most recently, there's been this Gupta leaks that's linking this very wealthy family with the Zuma clan.
That's the criminal gang that he was referring to in the clip that we just heard. So what's the allegation against the Guptas?
Basically that they're buying political influence, and there's been this massive expose via a leak of an enormous trove of emails and other documents that seems to prove what people have been suspicious of for years. And increasingly, it just looks like the Guptas have been involved in this state capture is the phrase that's being used. But yeah, so yes, it may feel short to us until they have a president, but I'm sure when you're living under it, getting a new party leader and getting a president must feel a long way away.
And let's not forget, South Africa has just fallen back into technical recession. Factories are closing all over the place. Its debt was just downgraded to junk status. It's got real economic problems. If you've got to wait 2 more years while this guy who's been slowly mismanaging the economy since 2009 comes out of office, potentially, and I'm not 100% convinced that will be the case. Municipal elections are very different from national elections, as we saw in this country in May. The result was very different from the result in June. I think smaller turnouts and people see them as protest votes. But when push comes to shove, are enough black South Africans going to go out and vote for the white party, as we talked about earlier, however inaccurate that label may be? But even if it doesn't, in 2 years, if this economic mismanagement continues, who suffers the most from that? It's actually the poor black South Africans that are the ANC's lifeblood.
This is a long process, and I don't think anybody thinks that the ANC will lose the next presidential election. I think that this is a shift that may manifest itself the election after that, possibly the one after that. But there is a huge impatience and this sense of growing crisis has really been unfolding over several years, if not more than a decade by now. And I think within South Africa, there's a real fear that what's happening is a movement towards a failed state. I'm actually slightly more optimistic about that. I think you see quite a lot of strong institutions in South Africa, particularly the court system, which is applying some kind of accountability. To me, it looks more like a situation in which a fledgling democracy has only been a democracy for 23 years is sort of finding the limits of how it holds its rulers to account. And the fact that there is a strong opposition emerging is actually a very positive sign for the future.
And does it show just how much Mandela was holding the whole thing together? I mean, this is something that people said quite often in the last few years of his life, wasn't it? Just watch that country when Mandela dies, because everyone's sort of keeping it together for now. But the moment he dies, the figurehead's gone. They have got a lot of underlying problems.
Yes, and the extent to which any conversation you have in South Africa moves inexorably towards race, I think, is a real underlying issue. And what I think Mmusi Maimane is really trying to do is embody some of that promise that Mandela bestowed on the country. There's clearly huge shoes to fill, and I don't think anyone would say he's quite there yet. But the fact that he is able to lead this kind of multiracial party with a supporter base that is split between blacks and whites and Indian South Africans and the various people in between, I think is a sign for optimism.
Incidentally, just talking dynastically, why isn't there a Mandela on the ballot sheet? He had enough kids, didn't he? Are there none of them that are showing potential to step in there and just be the Mandela someone can vote for?
Mandela himself didn't want to be president. He was really strong-armed into it, and he certainly didn't want to run for a second term. So I think maybe they have learned from his experience that it's just a very, very difficult job.
OK, Ashley, it's your turn next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is there trouble brewing at the National Trust?
Official accounts of Robert's life tend to offer only a partial story and neglect to incorporate what was widely accepted by those who knew him. Some adopt a language of codes and suggestions, describing him as the bachelor squire or not one for the ladies. But the truth is, when researching Robert's life, we find many accounts that openly acknowledge his homosexuality, adding, of course, that to be gay when he lived could lead to prosecution under the law.
It's like listening to a Harry Potter audiobook, isn't it? Stephen Fry there in a film for the National Trust about the last Squire of Felbrigg, Robert Wyndham Ketton Kramer. It might not be a name that is that familiar to you. If you want to find out more about him, you can find that film on their YouTube channel, East of England NT. Ashley, Felbrigg Hall has been at the centre of a new controversy this week about this film and the repercussions of it. Talk us through the story.
Well, the controversy has been going on since late July, and it's related to the Prejudice and Pride campaign that the National Trust is running as part of the events around the country marking the 50 years since the decriminalisation of homosexuality or homosexual acts. In particular, in this case, and in many cases around National Trust properties, there are former owners, now benefactors to the National Trust, who were gay in their lifetime, but that wasn't known in their lifetime for various reasons, normally relating to the fact it was illegal during their lifetime.
So in the case of this squire, homosexuality was only partially decriminalised 2 years before he died.
Exactly. And of course, attitudes don't change just because the law changes, as we've found out with many other changes. So it's no surprise it wasn't publicly known, although the National Trust and the people who researched it from the University of Leicester say that it was very clear from the people they interviewed and from artefacts that it was very widely known amongst his friendship group. So what they've done is, as part of these commemorations, they've commissioned this film, The Unfinished Portrait, and they talk openly about the sexuality of this owner and the context of his life as part of the events going on at Felbrigg Hall. As part of that, they asked their volunteers to wear rainbow-coloured lanyards and badges.
Well, interesting use of the word asked, because, this is where the controversy comes from. Is it they told their volunteers to wear rainbow lanyards?
They said if you want to, this is going to be part of the event, so if you want to continue face-to-face interaction, this is part of the uniform. 10 volunteers refused and went home and apparently lost sleep and all sorts, and went to the newspapers, as you do. And the National Trust was eventually forced to back down just this past weekend.
And so it is optional.
An optional thing.
Yes.
Which I think says an awful lot about the problem brewing at the National Trust with its demographic issue, where attitudes are likely to be very different from the wider population.
because people who volunteer for the National Trust tend to be retired pensioners with an interest in tradition.
Exactly. And in fact, there's been articles dating back to 2015 where the National Trust has been saying, actually, we've got a big problem with older volunteers because they're not retiring as early anymore, or when they do, they want to go on holidays. They become childcare for their, hard-pressed families who can't afford third-party childcare. So actually, they're not available to go and stand in rooms all day telling people about, where the provenance of some wardrobe. So it's that's a big problem that's brewing for them, and they have actually said they're going to leave rooms unmanned in the future potentially because they just won't have the numbers.
Okay. Obviously, some of those people who refused to wear the lanyards were straightforwardly homophobic, I guess, and there's no point pretending otherwise. But is it necessarily homophobic to say, I don't think it was right to out this squire, you haven't got his permission, he's only been dead for 50 years, and I don't feel comfortable being told to wear a lanyard that's expressing a political position from an organisation that I'm volunteering for? Holden.
I'm not entirely comfortable with the idea that wearing the lanyard should be compulsory. Partly, I think, because the rainbow symbol, if it means anything, should be a symbol of allegiance and support. And if people are wearing it under duress, resentfully, that seems to take away any of that sort of, kind of symbol of friendship that it ought to have.
And yet we have this debate around poppies every year, don't we? And not that people necessarily wear them under duress, but they know to not wear them in the public eye is then making a statement. So they do feel pressure. Yeah,
I would tend to come down on the same side of that argument as well, is that it should be voluntary. I suppose the difference here is that, although I don't know whether volunteers are technically employees, but it was an organisation where people were being told that essentially their services were not required unless they put on this symbol, which they happened not to agree with.
I mean, we do see this tension, don't we, Arion, between clearly the central organising structure of the National Trust, who are trying to be cool and progressive and with it. Apparently they have a campaign about feminism coming up as well. I'm sure that will go down equally well with their volunteers. And saying, I suppose, in a slightly revisionist way, from a National Trust perspective, let's look back at our history, let's celebrate the fact there were homosexuals and women, as well as these old men that ran castles. And their volunteers who actually have opted in to give their time because they want to tell the world about the history accurately at the time as it would have been presented to people then, which actually would not have made any mention of a man's sexuality. It just wasn't in the public sphere.
Maybe not, but is that the story that they're meant to tell, the story that existed at the time? Or, I mean, hypothetically, if we find out that the story, that some other totally different story is entirely wrong and subsequent history has proven it to be wrong, you'd want to hear the rest of that story, would you not? I mean, coming back to the ethical question, I almost think it's an interesting idea that employees should have the opportunity to offer their own ethical perspective on what the organisation as a whole is doing. It so happens that I don't agree with the people who refuse to wear the lanyards in this case, but the idea of being forced into a position by the organisation for whom you work or for whom you volunteer is a thing that we all put up with. We just agree that you have to leave your morals at the door and do what you're told for the duration.
You hate recycling, for example. You're always saying you'd much rather just throw everything in the bin, but here it is.
Exactly.
Endless non-paper work. But actually, I wonder if it does as well just show that the rainbow flag is complicated and it means different things to different people. I mean, in fairness, probably some of the people who said they wouldn't wear the lanyard, if it was explained to them that the reason they were wearing it was very much in the spirit of a say no to racism type idea, they're wearing it to show they're inclusive to homosexual guests and they believe people shouldn't be prejudiced against, perhaps many more of them would have taken up the opportunity. I imagine people of a certain age see that flag and think, well, this means I support basically homosexual sex. That's what people of that generation think, and they might think, well, I'm a Christian and I don't. It raises other issues, doesn't it, in terms of it's not clearly explained what it means.
I disagree with that, really. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to anyone who thinks about it that the rainbow badge is a sign of solidarity. I think even the way you phrased the question there, which, it may well be the way people are thinking about it, but effectively it still amounts to, I don't want to support homosexuality, which I don't think necessarily we should be sort of celebrating.
An 80-year-old might think, this means I'm a homosexual. You know, that's wrong, but I can understand why they have that.
I can't imagine how they would get to that conclusion. And if they do, then perhaps that smacks of even more prejudice than just refusing to vote because they don't want to support it.
But isn't that the generation gap? You can't imagine how they could get to that conclusion. They can't imagine how wearing a rainbow flag means I'm inclusive.
Perhaps it is, but I still think there's an element of we shouldn't perpetuate that just because it's something that older people think. I mean, to tell a different story, for example, Pink News had an article about a place called Kingston Lacey, which is in Dorset. It was owned by a gay man called William Banks. He invested a lot of money, a lot of time in restoring that hall. He was a gay man. He eventually was hounded out of the country because he was facing charges for homosexual acts. That was not known in his lifetime, and actually that only came to light because of prejudice and pride. So should we not have told his story? This is a man who actually spent a lot of money in restoring a property. He's the only reason, really, that property is available and to be bequeathed to the nation. And yet we're arguing, should we tell his story? Because at the time we had regressive laws, and apparently we now need to support, the telling of those regressive laws as it was at the time.
Having come down against the National Trust on the lanyards, I'd actually come down on their favour for the video itself. I think that was a useful project, and there's a bit of an ethical question about outing people, and generally I think it's a bad idea unless there's a question of hypocrisy. But in this case, because he has been dead for 50 years and because he was relatively open, it seems, even in the 1960s, I can't imagine that he would be particularly upset about his story being
he
told. He
probably
in
wouldn't
this
still be in
context.
the closet now if he was still alive now. Yeah.
And I think there's a real benefit to it because we were talking a couple of weeks ago about the sort of swift progression of gay rights, and I was suggesting it's partly because there were gay people at all levels of society and in all sorts of places, and I think perhaps one of the gaps in that story has been the story of more elderly gay people and the pain and shame they suffered as a result of attitudes at that time. And I think telling that story might actually help people of the generation of the National Trust members and volunteers to perhaps see a bit more of a connection with them and understand how perhaps their friends and acquaintances may silently have been suffering in the same way.
We can all agree, though, that it's sort of inevitable, though, this controversy, isn't it? I mean, it would be similar if they were exploring the contribution that the Empire had made, to our fight during the war. I mean, there would be people who work for the National Trust who would say, yes, by all means, have an exhibition about Indian soldiers, but I'm not involved in the National Trust. I mean, let's be honest, a lot of the people who volunteer for the National Trust are very much not of that demographic that's interested in reflecting those people.
But maybe the controversy was inevitable, but the Telegraph jumping on it as extremely as they did was maybe not quite so inevitable, and it could have been a much smaller thing. What were the numbers? It was
240 members. Apparently, this was a headline in both the Independent and the Telegraph. Actually, 240 members wrote to complain and to say they could be resigning their membership. That's 0.01% of the 2.22 million National Trust members.
Exactly. So it could have been a much smaller issue than it was if it hadn't been.
It could have not
inflamed.
It could have not been an issue at all if the National Trust had made it voluntary to start with.
Yes,
exactly.
Isn't this voluntary thing a little bit of a red herring, though? Because ultimately the National Trust as an organisation wants to show solidarity. So it'd be the same as, we work for a company. If that company wanted to show solidarity with a cause, if it says to its employees, you don't have to do this, and maybe even just through inertia, many of them don't, majority of them don't, then to what extent has the organisation actually followed through on its pledge to support it? If the National Trust was going to show solidarity, and it felt as part of that there needed to be some visual, signing of that, and then, let's say all 350 volunteers said, well, it's optional, I'm not going to do it because I'm old and prejudiced, then, I'm not saying that's the case, I'm just saying that in a hypothetical world, then to what extent has the National Trust actually shown solidarity? Surely the organisation has to have the agency here.
They made the film.
They did. Stephen Fry wonderfully narrated.
Arion, what do you think this week's going to be remembered for?
So apparently by the time the decade is out, we're all going to be eating bug burgers and cricket cookies.
On the southwest tip of Wales, in Britain's smallest city, St David's, it's Market Day. Alongside the stalls of jams, meats and cheeses on sale is local farm produce with a difference.
Hello, would anyone like to try some edible insects?
And insect scientist Dr. Sarah Bainan and her partner, award-winning chef Andy Holcroft, are causing quite a buzz about town with their edible bugs.
These are Mexican red grasshoppers that have been lightly spiced with chili as well. So these are quite a salty snack. 2 billion people are eating insects every day.
So the burgers are a blend of mealworms, crickets, grasshoppers and buffalo worms.
That one had its little eyes going, hello! They are lovely.
Would you like another one?
That was a hint, wasn't it?
That was Cyril Jenkins there, introducing the documentary The Big Grub Couple, which first aired on BBC One on Monday night. If you're listening in the UK right now, you can find the show on BBC iPlayer. Arion, does this mean we are all about to start eating insects?
Perhaps.
Perhaps this is your story of the week. Yes.
If
this is the moment
documentary, if the BBC documentary is to be believed, then we are. The programme followed this relatively young couple, one a chef, one an entomologist, and their efforts to get us all to do exactly that. They started their own research farm and cafe a couple of years ago, but the program itself was actually following them trying to break a particular product, which was these cricket cookies, into the mainstream market. So they go internationally to, well, first they product test it to see if people actually will eat it, then they go find a supplier, and then they try and get it distributed. And so, and the steps that they take reveal that perhaps counterintuitively, or unexpectedly at least, people are much more receptive to the idea of eating bugs than we might have thought.
People will do anything if you're filming them doing it. And there's a novelty to it, isn't there? You know, if someone said to me with a camera in their hands, hey, would you like to try my cricket cookie? I'd be like, yeah, I'll try your cricket cookie. That doesn't mean I'm going to go to Waitrose and buy one for £3.
Maybe, although the finding in the blind taste test that they conducted in the course of the program was that people preferred the cricket cookies, so apparently they're also uniquely delicious, if again, this is to be believed.
Holden, do you pay any credence to Arion's ridiculous story?
I have eaten both crickets and mealworms before.
Have you?
Only once in each case. It was inevitably at a PR event. And
what were they promoting?
This kind of food, it was.
Right, okay.
It wasn't just
wasn't
sort of
Sony
canapes.
going rogue.
The mealworms would have been fine if you didn't know they were mealworms. It's basically like mince, but because you know what they are, there's just this sort of revulsion that I'm sure I could get over in time, but I've seen no reason to. Mm-hmm. The crickets are tastier, but that's because they were soaked in chili and then deep fried. And I think if you soak anything in chili and deep fry it, it will be reasonably edible.
Here. I mean, we were hearing about ethical insects, I think they said just then in that clip, Arion. So they were farming them ethically. But, I mean, if this actually caught on and became a big widespread trend, then people would start importing their insects from the Far East. And I imagine that the way that they would be kept would not necessarily be all that ethical.
I think the ethical component is the fact that meat is very hard and expensive to produce, and there's a great ethical cost pretty much at every stage of meat production. I suspect a vegan or a relatively strict vegetarian would have ethical concerns about eating insects in the way that they would any other kind of living thinking creature. So if that's the ethical part you're trying to stamp out, I don't think this addresses that, but it does address the problems involved in the production of meat because insects are much more efficient producers of protein than cows and pigs and chickens.
I think, and also the elephant in the room, as it were, or the giant mealworm in the room, is that environmentalism, isn't it? You know, red meat. The UN has talked for years about the fact we need to eat less red meat because it's the single biggest contributor to climate change. So, in fact, a lot of people promote these alternative sources of protein because it will stop me eating my beef burger. I'll be eating a bug burger instead, and the world will be a better place. Although, if we do start importing them from the Far East, there's some air miles to take into account. Obviously, there are other solutions to solving the red meat issue. The UN's proposed solution was just eat less red meat. Yeah. We don't need to eat it 3 or 4 times a week, as I suspect we do in Britain on the average table.
Or there's lab-grown meat.
There is the rare burger. Was it called the rare burger that was also in the news? I think this week or last week. That
yours for 150 grand or something.
Yeah, I mean I haven't tried one yet.
Yeah, hasn't hit McDonald's.
I'm waiting for the PR event where they're selling them to me. But that sort of thing appeals to me a bit more. I'm quite squeamish about bugs.
Yeah.
But in this case, I think they didn't look like bugs, which would help.
That was true, although interestingly, people who were trying the different products that they'd produced actually wanted to see what they were eating. So the chef found that he had to put bugs back into the bug burgers, whole bugs, after having ground them up very diligently to produce the patties, because people wanted the experience, perhaps in that kind of tell your friends that you ate a mealworm.
You want to feel the crunch.
Yeah.
Isn't that this strikes me as the sort of thing a hipster cafe is going to end up doing and make a lot of money out of, but it won't catch on generally. I just, to your point about earlier, I mean, I don't see the millions of people who go to their Tesco, Asda, Waitrose, Sainsbury's buying their frozen burgers are going to go and buy whole crickets that they stick in a bun and things like that, and it's going to have to be normalised, isn't it? Otherwise it just becomes a preserve of the millennial novelty seekers.
Well, but if you can get people over that first step of intuitively disagreeing with eating insects, then maybe it just becomes an ingredient and people will be happy to buy insect burgers as they will to buy beef burgers.
There has been a slight shift, hasn't there, in terms of the budget supermarkets. They sort of seized this novelty meat angle, didn't they? Reindeer at Christmas time, famously and controversially. But I mean, actually, I bought some ostrich steaks from Aldi. I wouldn't have done that 10 years ago, even from Waitrose. So I guess there's a shift in, if you put it in those kinds of places, people will say, all right, I'll give it a go.
But it wasn't that long ago that sushi was seen as a step too far for British consumers, and now it's in every supermarket. So.
I think that's true, and these things do change over time, don't they? And obviously we're being very Western in this view because, street food stalls on the other side of the world, are stocked with bugs, bug kebabs and things.
An example of this, a while ago I lived in Tanzania for a while, and when I...
Full of surprises, Holden Frith, isn't it?
When I arrived, the teachers at the school I was working at threw a welcome meal for me and my housemate, and we were served a stew made from cow fat and bananas, and the cow fat was in sort of 2-inch chunks, and as you chewed it just fought back, and we struggled our way through this plate of food and got through as much as we can, and then a week or so later invited the teachers back for a return meal. My housemate had some pasta that he'd brought out with him from the UK. We made a bit of tomato sauce, served it up, and one of the teachers looked at it, stood up, walked to the front door and threw it out into the yard. Said he refused to eat it because it looked like worms. And I think there were two conclusions we drew from this. One was that there was no Tanzanian custom that required us to finish any food that we did not want to eat. But secondly, that sort of sense of cultural revulsion and norms around food is so locally specific. And
third, that worms are disgusting.
In all cultures.
Didn't it also show how ingrained some of this stuff is, though? I mean, you talked about ostrich burgers and things like that, but ultimately that is still a red bit of meat that looks like a bit of meat. I think I'm not saying that in 50, 100 years we won't all be eating bugs. I just don't think that we're going to be talking about the next decade. Britain is going to go through that much of a revolution because these food habits are so ingrained to the extent that someone looks at a piece of pasta and throws it out the door.
Except that sushi did change very quickly, and that almost seemed surprising. I don't know if you remember your first experience with sushi, but the idea of eating
sushi.
Have you not?
No,
You've never had sushi?
I've had the cooked chicken sushi because it's not all raw fish.
No, that doesn't count. Okay, well, that's a shock. Okay, so we're talking to the wrong person about bugs.
I failed at food. I know.
But there was quite a quick turnaround from people finding it disgusting to eat raw fish to now it just being in every high street store.
So what is the weirdest thing that you've eaten, Ashley? I'm sorry, I want to know. If you're a man who eats chicken sushi,
reasonably conservative in my
the oddest thing
in my food intake. Yeah, I don't know. I've not eaten any weird animals. I think I've eaten elk and things like that, but that's
elk,
which is moose. But that's
game.
It's just gamey.
Okay, Arion, weirdest thing you've ever eaten?
I did have a cockroach when I was travelling in Cambodia. Candied cockroach, not very tasty.
Yeah, okay. And Holden, I mean, you've given us two examples already.
I've eaten quite a lot of animals actually.
Spin-off podcast.
Animals I have eaten.
Next week, snake.
I have eaten snake.
Have you?
Yes. It's like chicken, inevitably.
Yeah, it's always like chicken. Right, well, on that, we have reached the end of this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Ashley Wassall, Arion McNicoll and Holden Frith. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk. You can sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday, or you can get the magazine, of course, direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And remember, you can find every single episode of this podcast, they don't date, wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. I have eaten alligator before, thanks for asking. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.